Thank you for tuning in to Psychology Is. I am your host, Nick Fortino. I'm so excited today to be in conversation with Dr. David Healy. Welcome, Dr. Healy.
Hi, Nick. It's good to be here, but it will be slightly better if you just call me David.
David, it is.
Great.
So, David Healy is a well-known psychiatrist. I have a strong feeling that many people who clicked on this video or pressed play are aware of David Healy. You're an author, professor, significant body of work focusing on many different aspects of the field of psychiatry, and you can fill in any gaps I have here in your introduction and wealth of knowledge. But I know that you focused a lot on the history of psychopharmacology and the pharmaceutical industry's influence on psychiatry. You're well known for being a vocal critic of certain practices within modern psychiatry, particularly the ways in which pharmaceutical companies market antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs. You've published many books, including the antidepressant era back in the 90s, the creation of psychopharmacology in the early 2000s, Let Them Eat Prozac, Mania, A Short History of Bipolar Disorder, Pharmageddon in 2012. You co-authored Children of the Cure in 2020. And these works, as I understand it, chronicle the rise of psychiatric medications and expose troubling conflicts of interest between academia and the drug industry. So I would love to begin by just asking you open-endedly, how did you get into all of this? Um, Including how did you decide to become a psychiatrist, but then how did you become a critic of the field?
Yeah. Okay, well, I got into all of this because having trained in medicine, I knew I wanted to go into the mental health field, and I was very therapy-oriented. Now, when I say therapy-oriented, at this point, it was Rogerian therapy that interested me. But I sort of thought I'd take a detour. There was an issue about how does the mind fit into the brain, and it looked like the pills that were beginning to come on stream might shed a bit of light on that. I mean, they were tools not just to treat people, but they were tools to look at, well, how does our brain work and how do we get a mind out of it? Now, fortunately, the pharmacology lab that I ended up in for 3 or 4 years was one where I had an opportunity to work on the serotonin reuptake system before the SSRI group of drugs came on stream. And that was extraordinarily fortunate because it meant that when these drugs came on stream, people working in the industry thought I was a good person to educate other doctors about what these drugs do. So they also saw me as one of them. I'm a person working on the serotonin reuptake system. I'm working in a pharmacology lab. So they were open about things and told me things that, most of my colleagues weren't hearing. It's hard to know whether the right word for me at the time was innocent or not, or whether, I was in this area because I was interested in the issues and taking in what most people on every side told me. Okay, now, in terms of working at what the SSRI group of drugs do, it was awfully clear very early on that there was nothing wrong with the serotonin system of people who were depressed. When I say early on, I mean the 1980s, it was clear. Okay, this is an older idea that had been raised in the 1960s, and by the 1980s, nobody thought there was anything wrong with the serotonin system in people who are depressed. So how do we end up with the idea that there is anything wrong with the serotonin system in people who are depressed? Well, that was something that came out of the marketing department of the pharmaceutical industry. It came out of SmithKline Beecham. And they invented the concept of the SSRI, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, there's nothing particularly selective about these drugs. They do work in the serotonin system, but they work on hundreds of other things as well. They aren't clean and pure drugs. And the other thing was, it was awfully clear that they were fairly weak as antidepressants. Uh, the industry people that I talked to made it clear that when they compared the newer SSRIs coming on stream during the 1980s with the older antidepressants, the older drugs always beat them. So the issue was, well, how do you bring a drug on the market that's going to be weaker and more expensive than the older drugs that are there? And the answer was easy. The marketing department will be able to sort this out. And in particular, the issues were, look, the money isn't in people who are severely depressed, which was a rare group of people who used to go into hospital to be treated with the older antidepressants or even ECT. The SSRIs didn't actually work for this group of people, but the money was people who were on the benzodiazepine group of drugs. And there was an opportunity opening up because during the 1980s, we were awfully concerned about people being hooked to the benzodiazepines. So the SSRIs could come on stream as the pill for everyday nerves that you didn't get hooked to. And one of the ways to sort of get that over to people was to call them antidepressants rather than anxiolytics. Because with the benzodiazepines, nobody's going to believe that you could have an anxiolytic drug that you wouldn't get hooked to, but the antidepressants weren't linked to people being hooked to them. As it turns out, within a few years of the SSRIs been on at the market, there are more reports of people being hooked to each of them than there were to the entire group of benzodiazepines put together over the previous 20 years. So this was interesting. But one of the other things that was clear from working in a pharmacology lab was that there was a thing then called behavioral pharmacology, which was a bunch of people who had a background in behavioral science, looking at rats and gerbils and things like that, giving them pills and looking at what happened to their behavior. They did some looking at what was going on in their brain also, but they were intensely interested in the behavior of these animals. And that's one of the things we've lost completely. And the point behind that is, well, we got the SSRIs from people, therapists, giving them to patients during the 1960s. Giving the older drugs to patients during the 1960s and saying, well, when I see people on antidepressants, they talk about, well, they've got a distinct change in the transference reactions that I noticed. This was the period where people in the States in particular were very Freudian. So they talked about transference. And the therapists treating these people noticed this pretty early on, pretty quickly after the person went on pills. And this was nothing to do with the illness getting better. This was a change in the interaction between two people that was awfully obvious, okay? And it's that led to the SSRI group of drugs, because a man called Arvid Carlson, listening to doctors say this to him and looking at the pills where they said, we can see it most clearly with these pills and not with those pills, said, well, the ones you seem to be seeing it most clearly with act on the serotonin system, and the ones where you figure it's maybe not happening don't act on the serotonin system. So let's try and make a drug that's a pure serotonin reuptake inhibitor that doesn't work on the noradrenaline system, which was the other big kind of system back then that people figured played a role in all this. And Carlson's SSRIs were the group of drugs that came out of this. And a key point in it is he figured there's nothing wrong with the serotonin system in people who are depressed. These drugs are going to work on a normal serotonin system just like LSD does. And LSD, as we all know, can give some people a good effect, one that they're impressed with, pleased with, and other people a really bad effect, one that doesn't really suit them. Carlson's view was, the SSRIs are going to be pretty much the same. And this is back, the first SSRI came in the market in the early 80s. This is long before Prozac. But his view was early on, what we're going to find is there'll be a group of patients that are suited to them and other patients who aren't suited to them who could even become suicidal. What do they do working the serotonin system? Well, LSD opens the gates to sensory kind of perceptions. You see things more clearly, more vividly, you hear things in more detail. Everything looks and feels good from that point of view. SSRIs close the gate. They mute it. They tone things down. Things don't look as colorful, don't sound as clear, don't smell as clear. And, what people on them report is they're less reactive. Their feelings are damped down. Things that they might have noticed before, they either don't notice or they aren't as bothered by if they do notice. So that's what the SSRI group of drugs do. That's what we're trying to get them to do, which may be useful. It's not a cure. The kinds of conditions people get these drugs for usually clear up of their own accord in 8, 10, 12 weeks. So it's more a case of making them feel a bit more comfortable during that period of time. It may add a little bit to the rate at which you get better if you're feeling a bit more comfortable. It won't add to the rate at which you're getting better if you're feeling bad. Okay, if you've actually become suicidal. And part of the problem we have at the moment is the idea that there's lowered serotonin in people who are depressed has left doctors and all sorts of people being told, look, these drugs can take about 6 or 8 weeks to work. The patient should be told that they aren't going to feel better quickly. So just keep taking the pills, which is a disaster. The answer really is that, you're going to, if they suit you, you're going to be able to tell people within a day or two that you're feeling more comfortable. And yes, this is the kind of thing that you've figured can help. And if you're not feeling that way, you really shouldn't be taking the pills for more than a day or two. You should be changed to a completely different kind of pill or a different kind of therapy. And one of the things that brought this home for me was we did a healthy volunteer study. And this was the end of the 1990s, to check and see was avocados right, that people getting a drug that acts on the serotonin system would be able to spot an anxiolytic effect that was useful for them, and people working on some pill that didn't work on the serotonin system wouldn't spot that. They'd have a different thing that they were able to say was useful. So we took a bunch of doctors and nurses who were working in the mental health unit that I was in back then, and they were all keen to check out all these pills that they'd been using and things like that. The patients in the unit didn't know that the staff were going to be on these pills, but within a day or two, they were able to approach me and say, look, is that doctor on a pill? And is he on an SSRI? And the answer is he was, and it was an SSRI.
Mhm.
The patients were better observers, better trained in handling mental health issues than the nursing staff and medical staff in the unit were. They'd been told these things take weeks to work. They put people on these drugs. They don't spot anything. The patients, even though they don't know you're on a drug, can spot, yep, he's on a drug. And it's not just patients in a mental health unit that can spot that. It's prisoners in jail. They can spot other people who've been involved with some kind of crime who end up in the prison wing that they're in. They can spot the people on the pills and the people who aren't. And your family and friends are able to spot these things as well and can say to you, look, this is suiting you, this is fine. Or no, you've had a change of personality and we're not sure it's all that helpful. So
Mhm.
this isn't the kind of thing anybody's been told, but if you don't get a feel good, a chill out feeling from these pills early on, you really shouldn't be on them, regardless of what your doctor actually says to you.
Mm. Wow. Dr. Healy and I took a quick pause to make some adjustments to our settings, and so your eyes are not playing tricks on you that he has indeed a different set of headphones on all of a sudden. But I'd like to respond to some of what you just laid out. First, just noting that I found it interesting what you said about how, decades ago when people were first being prescribed these SSRIs, that the therapists were noticing a reduction in the incidence of transference. And that is interesting to me. I've never heard that. And if anyone's not aware of what transference is in a therapeutic context, it's essentially when a person transfers or brings into the therapeutic relationship feelings, emotions that are actually based in a different relationship. There's a sort of projecting happening where I might be treating my therapist like my father, for example. And this might be unconscious, or it can be kind of brought to light. And some therapists work with that and use that as a way of better understanding the dynamics of this person's relationships. But it's interesting to me that there would be a reduction of that once the person is on, essentially a blunting psychoactive substance. And then you emphasized multiple times in what you were saying that there's nothing wrong with the serotonin system of people who are depressed. And I think many listeners of the Psychology as podcast are aware of that, but not everyone. It's still a extremely prevalent belief, especially in US culture, that, the chemical imbalance narrative, remains part of the collective kind of belief system. So it's just really worth emphasizing that is indeed a myth, that there isn't an existing chemical imbalance, that in fact, sometimes when we introduce psychoactive substances, only then do we find, a disturbance of a balanced brain chemical state. So there's nothing wrong with the serotonin system of people who are depressed. There's rather a much more complex set of factors contributing to depression. And then I also thought it was interesting the way you were describing the way that, you can think of something like LSD, which kind of opens and sensitizes perception. And then the so-called antidepressants have kind of the exact opposite effect, where they close it, they blunt it. And I, as a psychologist, often think about and observe the connection between perception and emotion and behavior. I see a clear link between these aspects of our experience where, to me, it's clear that perception really gives rise to emotion, and emotion really fuels our behaviors. And so if you are altering a person's mode of perception, whether you're sensitizing it or blunting it, there will always be a corresponding alteration of emotional activity. And if that occurs, well, then there will always be a difference in the person's behavior. Because if I'm not feeling as strongly, I won't be acting in the same way. So I just think that is really, again, also worth highlighting.
Let me
And
pick up on that, Nick.
please.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I'd slightly alter the way you put it. I'd say the SSRIs change sensation, the sensory system. The single commonest thing they do is within 30 minutes of your first pill, they can make you genitally numb. Now, that's the point that people pick up on, but it happens to the skin around the rest of your body as well. The people sense touch less acutely.
Mm,
And this correlates very closely with what they call emotional numbing also. Now, this is emotions in the sense of feelings, literally
mhm,
your
mhm,
feelings. Now, it also applies to your vision. It applies to your balance. It applies to your hearing. It applies to your proprioceptive senses in your bones and joints and all of these things are actually changed by the SSRI group of drugs. And these drugs, like the beta blocker drugs or the benzodiazepines, essentially they're acting on the body. There's very little serotonin in our heads. The bit of it that's in our brain is in what used to be called the reptile brain or the bird brain. 5% of it, 95% of it is in the rest of our body. When I went into this area, I was thinking, it will be helpful to think about these drugs to work out how the mind fits into the brain. The brain has very little to do with it. It's how the mind fits into the body. Your body, the boundary between us and the outside world is our skin. It's not our brain. The brain then tries to interpret, what am I being told by my senses? And often gets it wrong. The senses we have do a lot of the so-called thinking.
Mm.
And if they're turned down, just like LSD, when the whole thing's turned up and things get awfully colorful and things like that, you can become a little bit crazy. We also know that if you have sensory deprivation, you can go a bit crazy as well. So,
Yeah, I understand your point. It's very interesting that, that SSRIs, given that serotonin circulates throughout the entire body and the majority of it is actually outside the brain, that it's all impacted, the entire body is impacted. And you're saying that on all 5 major sensory systems, there's a blunting effect,
yes.
which
And
leads me
it's
to,
the
go ahead.
company marketing and the use of the word antidepressant
Mm.
that has got us thinking about the brain. Now,
Right.
it's also the case of LSD. People think the effects of LSD are happening through our brain. They're probably not. It's the same with LSD. It's acting on the serotonin system throughout the body. So we're very brain focused.
Yeah.
Have become, under the influence of these drugs, have become very brain focused in a way that may be less helpful and less appropriate than we think.
Mm. Well, when we understand this, like the nature of so-called antidepressants, which again, like you're saying, is a term that was coined by pharmaceutical companies, knowing that it would conjure up certain, sort of impressions in our mind. Um, how is it that anyone could see this as a therapeutic agent if this is the mechanism of action?
Well, we use the beta blocking group of drugs. These are drugs that block beta receptors and slow your heart rate and make you less likely to kind of perspire and things like that. Less likely to have some of the features of anxiety. And we use these drugs and they fool the brain. The brain says his heart rate is slow, he isn't perspiring, there's no particular shake in his hand, his voice isn't quavering so much. This looks like might be a stressful situation, but he doesn't seem to be anxious, so things are fine. The benzodiazepines are a little bit the same. They relax muscular tension, and the brain, trying to work out what's going on, comes up with a view, well, maybe things look a bit stressful, but David Healy seems to be reasonably calm at the moment, so he isn't anxious. And the other way around, every so often, a beta blocker will increase your heart rate and you start thinking you're anxious when you're not. And in fact, when we hold this group of drugs, usually your heart rates slow down. And when we hold the drugs, your heart rate for a period of time, for 48 to 72 hours, speeds up. And cardiologists know to say to you, look, you're going to think you're anxious, but you're not. This is just what the drugs are doing. And it's very much the same in terms of the SSRI group of drugs. They're kind of making you figure, they're making you less vigilant. You're not there looking acutely at all the things going on, trying to work out what do I need to do to escape this particularly stressful situation. You're there just thinking, well, doesn't seem to be too much going on. And the brain figures, well, he doesn't seem to be particularly vigilant. He isn't anxious.
Mm, makes sense. And I see that as being quite problematic if indeed there is something to be depressed about, or if indeed there is something in a person's circumstances that calls for action, that calls for a strong emotional response, that calls for significant change. And so, how often do you think it happens that a person is put on some type of, psychoactive substance like this, and then ultimately fails to kind of seek maybe this type of social support that they really need, or seek the whatever it is that they really need in their life?
Yeah. Well, you can say, for instance, if I'm a person that plays a musical instrument, maybe the violin, maybe the piano, in front of a crowd, and I get anxious, or if I have to give a lecture and I get anxious and my voice is going to quaver, maybe a beta blocker or maybe a benzodiazepine or whatever could be halfway useful to get me to the point where I'm performing and can do without the pill. Okay? It's clearly not a great idea to spend the rest of my concert life on these pills. It may be useful to take them if they suit me. Now, this is a key point. Arvid Carlson, creates the SSRI group of drugs. They're his pet. He figures they're going to help some people, but not all people. And they're used a lot to treat people who've got obsessive compulsive disorder. He was faced at one point with a group of patients who said to him, look, we've got OCD and people have put us on SSRIs, which are the number one treatment for this. They don't suit us. We figure smoking is better. And this is actually smoking nicotine, not cannabis. So he ran a trial of people who didn't figure the SSRIs helped them, and was able to show that actually for these patients, nicotine can be a lot better. And nicotine is also anxiolytic. It's one of these things where we've got this idea that these drugs work. On average, in a clinical trial, maybe you get 51% of people show a response to them, the other 49% don't. Often these clinical trials, I think, get misinterpreted to suggest that what we're seeing with the SSRIs is a placebo effect. People who respond poorly to them and people who respond well would say, absolutely not. There's nothing placebo about this. I think it's much more a case of, like cognitive behavior therapy, or Freud, or everything else, different therapies suit different people. We've got very accustomed with the pills and therapies to figure one size fits all. If you're Freudian, you're going to treat everybody this way. If you're into CBT, you're going to give everyone CBT. It isn't the case that any more than with the pills. With SSRIs, there are people who will be helpful, be helped by them, and a lot of people who won't. If you've got a severe problem, they aren't going to help you at all. You certainly shouldn't be on them for long. Is it a bad idea that, people have been on them for the length of time that they're on them? Yes, it's an awful idea. I don't think when they're introduced first to anybody, when they're introduced first as antidepressants, the standard wisdom was, we put you on these pills until the episode clears up and maybe keep you on them for 2 or 3 months afterwards. That's it. We now have people taking SSRIs for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
So you're saying that there's essentially, no situation in which it would be justifiable for a person to be on antidepressants for years.
Yes. If there are people who try to come off them and they've been told, look, it's a bit like insulin for diabetes. You got low serotonin and you may need to take these drugs for the rest of your life. They try to come off them because they're feeling well, and all of a sudden they feel acutely suicidal. And they say, my God, my doctor was right. I do need to keep taking these, because the problem clears up when they go back on them. These drugs are saving their lives, but they're saving their lives from a problem the drug is causing. It's not a problem they had to begin with.
Mm. That is so important. And I know many people are familiar with the term iatrogenic harm, drug caused harm. And, what a mess that we have on our hands, that so many people are experiencing this iatrogenic harm and are led to believe that that issue is somehow rooted in their psychology, rooted in their biology, and that it's the drug that's actually helping that when it's actually the drug that's causing that. What a serious problem this is. And so
It's a
what
public
would
health crisis. Yes. I
mm,
mean, we really have a major public health crisis. It's people on these drugs don't make love the way they want to make love. And when you come off the drugs, you may never be able to make love properly again. If you're male, your sperm count's full. If you're female, you're much more likely to miscarry. And we have declining fertility rates across the Western world where these drugs are used. So, these are pretty serious problems. We also have a problem, which is when you get a bit older and have a bunch of physical illnesses and need to be on a few different pills, we know, all things but equal, you shouldn't be on much more than 3 or at the most maybe 5 pills. Well, if you're on an SSRI that you can't get off and maybe a mood stabilizer that's thrown in, because a lot of doctors are educated to think, well, if people become suicidal on these drugs, this means they're bipolar. And rather than stop the SSRI, they add mood stabilizers in. And these are awfully hard to get off as well. So when you're there later on figuring there are drugs you need for a cardiac problem or other problem, you're ending up between one thing and the other on 6, 8, 10 different drugs and it's because of the psychotropic drugs that you just can't get off. It's grim. Mm.
grim?
Yeah.
With your example of nicotine being anxiolytic, that's very interesting to me. And I was going to kind of um, bring something up along that vein. And it is that, so I guess I would frame my question this way. I don't feel convinced that psychiatric drugs are really ever justifiable. And I realize that that may come across as a very crazy thing to say. But I see this as, the way these drugs work is quite similar to the way that any psychoactive substance works, any recreational or illicit substance works, in that they produce a pharmacological effect. There's no cause being addressed. There's no balance being brought on. There's nothing but a mechanism of action here where neurotransmitter activity is being altered and it's producing subjective changes. And so, I think of the way that many people experience intense social anxiety, and they deal with that by drinking alcohol. This is so common, and I'm not condemning that. But when people drink alcohol, they know what they're doing. They don't think that they are taking a medicine that is curing their social anxiety. They're well aware that they're drinking alcohol because the alcohol calms them down. It's not addressing the roots of their social anxiety. It's simply, in a sense, suppressing it, masking it, or altering their state.
Mm.
And I see SSRIs and all the other psychiatric drugs as fundamentally working in that way. And I think there are many psychiatrists, and I don't know if you're one of them. You can speak for yourself, but I think there are many psychiatrists who would never prescribe someone tequila for their social anxiety, but they would prescribe someone some type of anxiolytic for their social anxiety. And I don't see how that makes sense. So can you help me understand, what is the rational case for the prescription of psychiatric drugs at all?
Yeah, and you've stolen one of my favorite lines, which is, yeah, I often have a problem talking to educated professionals, liberal elite generally, and say, look, the art of medicine is about bringing good out of the use of a poison. And I get hissed at. And I say, well, I'm not promoting nicotine, but I can tell them the Arvid Carlson story. I'm not promoting nicotine because my father died from lung cancer. Okay. And everybody knows nicotine's a poison. But a lot of people smoked because they were bringing good out of it. Just like you mentioned, taking alcohol can be useful to handle social uh, anxiety. And places like Oxford and Cambridge wouldn't work without alcohol. But anyway, yeah. So, I think that's a point we've lost, which is it's a bit like nicotine and alcohol. A good doctor or therapist or whoever can bring good out of the use of these things. But if we're going to bring good out of the use of them, I've got to remember that I'm poisoning you, and you've got to be told that you're being poisoned, and keep a hawk eye out, as your family do as well, for any hints that you're being poisoned. Because if there's more problems happening than the good we're trying to bring out of this, then really we need to get you off this as soon as we can. But I like to, one of the problems we got, and how much the antidepressants contributed to this, I'm not sure, is the therapy industry in the broader sense, either using pills or therapies like CBT or whatever. We've got a situation where these things are wonderful for governments because they locate the problems in us rather than out there, rather than solving them politically. When you're told you're not thinking logically, you're the fault's in you, we need to correct this with CBT, that's as harmful as giving you a pill, potentially. We can bring good out of CBT if it's the right thing for you, or interpersonal therapy, behavior therapy, or even Freud, if these things are the right things for you. But there's a hazard, which is saying there was something wrong in you to begin with, rather than the social system we're all caught up in.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the idea that we need to be thinking together how to improve the situation we all have, rather than trying to fix particular individuals.
Amen. I think that is one of the most crucial points in this whole analysis of, the big picture of it all. It's so true. Like, and if we imagine, if we just kind of turn the volume up and kind of hyperbolize societal conditions and imagine a society that is dystopian, how great it would be, like you just said, for the governing body that everyone believes that all of their feelings, which are clearly a response to this dystopia, are actually sourced from my
But
own
yeah.
pathologies, my own
Mm.
complexes, my own problems, and that I need to treat myself. And even if we do then have safe, effective treatments, it's like, well, we're still not addressing the real problem, which is whatever level of the social system, right? It could be the household, it could be the community, it could be the broadest level, entire culture. So I just think this is such an important point, and I thank you for articulating it. It's one of the most like subversive is the word that comes to my mind, or just kind of it's like we're being gaslit into thinking that we are insane when it's in reality often it's the conditions of our society that are so antithetical to human flourishing.
Yep.
Mm.
Well, one of the other things linked into that is we've lost, and it's the thing that when I was younger was much more obviously okay. Hmm. There used to be a field of psychology called individual psychology. Now, you got people like um, Hans Eysenck that were linked to it, but it was much more a German thing. It was linked to people like Jung and things like that, who were saying people are different. There's a huge amount of variation between people. And rather than trying to obliterate it, we
Mm.
need to cherish it, because any good team, any good football team needs the people that can score the goals and the people who can make sure the other team can score goals. And these are different skills. These days, we're in the business of trying to normalize everyone, bring you to a norm. You've got introverts and extroverts. We relabel these as illnesses, ADHD and ASD, and we're in the business of trying to treat everybody on a score. We've got a scale of some sort. We're trying to get everybody to the middle, which isn't good for the wider team. And, we need a range of different skills to be able to
Yes,
sort, the things out that we're faced with.
that's a beautiful analogy. I like that a lot. Yes. And then to think what it does to an individual, to their sense of self, how much it undermines their sense of self, their own integrity, to come to believe that there's something wrong with me. There's something deeply flawed about the way I function. Uh, well, I would love to, maybe just to kind of wrap this part up. So I guess just to ask you very bluntly, like, in your own experience as a psychiatrist, do you
Mhm.
prescribe, antidepressants or any other psychiatric drug? And if so, how do you make sense of doing that?
Yeah, and the answer is that I do prescribe them in the Pinel sense of the word. And Philippe Pinel, 200 years ago, said, it's great to have treatments that might help, but it's even greater art to know when not to give them. So if you're a person who thinks the pills can be useful, you gotta have this extra art, which is, yes, this can be useful, but I need to know when not to dish these things out. So, yeah, it's very, and key to getting things right is a close relationship with the person you're working with. Rather than an evidence-based medicine, we need a relationship-based medicine. We need to recognize that the people who come into me are going to be different to me. They're not going to think the same way as me. And I've got to work hard at trying to work out what is it that I can possibly do that's going to help this particular person. And I've got to keep a hawk eye on them, not think they've been put in a pill that I approve of or given a therapy that I approve of. They must be getting better. When they start telling me they're not getting better, I need to believe them.
Mhm.
These these are the key. I mean, I've been working the serotonin system and antidepressants and things like this for 40 years. Literally, I think every week of the year, I learn new things about it from the people who are on these pills, who get in touch with me and say, look, I've been on this pill and this is what's happened to me. Um, and a lot of the problem doctors have these days, they're operating according to guidelines, which are based on the research literature. Supposedly it's evidence-based medicine, it's clinical trials and things like that, which give you average effects, not anything that tells you how to treat the person right in front of you. And as a result of this, because they're operating according to evidence-based medicine rather than what I like to call evident-based medicine, uh, they are having a heart-sink time. People aren't getting better. And the job could be a lot more interesting and fun if you pay heed to people who come in and talk to you about the problems they've got with the treatment you've just given them. And you react by saying, well, that is interesting. Let's try and work on it. And the patient says to you, well, I have been working and I've done a bunch of research and here's what I found. You end up with 100 free research assistants
Mm.
rather than 100 heart-sink patients. So that's what's gone wrong. We've got evidence-based medicine telling doctors and therapists generally what to do, which is making them into into bureaucrats rather than people who are professionals.
And so in your own practice, when you calculate that, a psychiatric drug would be useful for a person, what is the longest period of time that you would like keep them on it? And uh, that part you said a few minutes ago, which I thought was so profound, after I gave the example of like alcohol for social anxiety, and you said, we need to make it clear that this is a poison and you need to know that you are taking a poison. To me, that's profound. And we know that when we drink alcohol, right? And so, and yet I'm not suggesting that no one should ever drink alcohol. We should just be aware that it is essentially a poison that can have some side benefits. So how explicit are you when you prescribe that essentially this is a poison, and how long do you keep prescribing it to people?
Yeah, I think the answer here is when you put it like that, it sounds like I'm the expert in control. And what I'm trying to say to you is my role is to be responsive. And sometimes these things get pitched in terms of informed consent. What do you tell people? And this can be tricky. I mean, yes, people need to be told there are all sorts of hazards. We are giving you a poison, okay? But an almost more important point is, which isn't happening, which is what the patient needs to know is when they have a problem and come back to me, that I'm going to be open to hearing about it. And their experience from most doctors is that these guys turn out to be pretty, I mean, they seem like nice people. They often turn out to be pretty nasty people when you try and hint that the pill they gave you is actually causing problems. Most
Mm,
people are too nervous to really mention this.
mm.
They kind of don't talk about the problems that they're having. So it's not, I mean, it's rarely a case of, I'd say it's close to never, that I'd say to people that, you need to be on this for X period of time. It's very much a case of, we need to get a pill that may suit you if that's what you've opted for. I mean, it may be the case that you and I will opt for the fact that, we're not going to put you on a pill, and I'm going to see you every week or two to see how things are going. My hunch is this going to clear up after a few weeks. If it doesn't, then we might turn to a pill. But then there's the issue about how long do we keep you on it? And it's very much a case of the lowest possible dose for the shortest period of time.
I hope any practicing psychiatrists who are listening right now take heed. The lowest possible dose for the shortest amount of time seems like a responsible principle.
Well, one of the things about the SSRIs is the companies brought them on the market at toxic doses. Prozac 20 milligrams sounds like a low dose to most people. It's the upper end of the dose range. It was a toxic dose. The company had done trials on a 5 milligram dose and showed it worked as well, but they didn't like the idea of bringing on in low doses or optional doses. They
Mm.
figured the best marketing approach was one size fits all, and they went for a toxic dose.
Well, that I think is a good segue into talking about the powerful influence of the pharmaceutical companies over, the dissemination, the prescription, the widespread use, the long-term use, the whole framing of not only the drugs themselves, but the disorders. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this idea of, marketing mental illness, framing mental illness, and the role of these drug companies on this whole situation?
Yeah. Well, the first point is it's not just mental illness. Companies sell heart pills, respiratory pills, gut pills, and, they operate much the same way with all these pills. There's a slide I tend to use in talks, which is to show people a slide of 4 different kinds of constipation. And there's 4 different ways that you can treat people who've actually become constipated. There's 4 different kinds of laxatives. Now, the regulatory framework we have at the moment is one where regulators like MHRA in the UK or FDA in the United States, they don't ever test the drugs. They look over what the company sends into them. It's a bit like the Federal Aviation Authority looks over the material Boeing sent into them. They don't test the plane. They don't fly it. They don't know how to build planes. They just read the paperwork and let Boeing's actually get a license. In the case of antidepressants or drugs like that, what the regulator does is they license the company to use a word. They say, yes, you've got the paperwork. Not that it proves the drug is safe or that it works. In the case of the paperwork, in the case of most trials, more lives are lost on the active treatment than on the placebo. And this is not just antidepressants. This is almost all drugs across medicine. There's very few drugs that get submitted to the regulator that can be shown to save lives. So regulators license the use of a word, and companies then go out. And in the case of a laxative, for instance, this may help bring the point home. They've got approval to use the word laxative. Now, we used to know, and everybody used to know, that there's lots of different kinds of constipation. Your grandmother would have known that not all constipations are the same. There's different kinds of laxatives that may help, and if the one we give you doesn't seem to work, we need to change it. Because if we keep you on the wrong laxative, you are going to create treatment-resistant constipation. Companies selling laxatives, however, aren't interested in the issue of, is our laxative the laxative for you? They just want you to have their laxative. They don't mind if you're on the other 3 kinds also, so you're on 4 all told. That would just mean you had a very severe form of constipation and needed loads of laxatives. And that's the problem we've got. The antidepressant companies get the approval to use the word antidepressant. Doctors no longer think about, well, is this the right kind of pill for this person? They just figure it's an antidepressant. Let's give something proven to work. But it's a bit like nicotine and SSRIs and alcohol. These things, there may be one of these things that's going to work for and help you, but being on 3 or 4 of them together because they all work is a recipe for treatment-resistant mood disorders, which we didn't have before the SSRIs. We now have people who are applying for medical assistance in dying, young people in their early 20s, because they're in such a wretched state and there's no prospects of being able to put them right with any pills, because we don't have any pills that have been designed to correct the situation that being on a bunch of different pills that weren't the right pill for you can cause. So, we're ending up in a pretty grim situation, and it's only going to get grimmer, I think, unless we can how to put things right. Well, it's tricky. Regulators, we in 1962 with the thalidomide crisis, it seemed like things needed to be done. And the previous act was all about companies being forced to show their drug was safe to use. We introduced the idea that if a drug doesn't work, it can't be safe, so let's force them to prove their drugs both work and are safe. The problem we've got now is the companies say, well, we've shown our drug works. They don't talk about things
Mm.
actually being safe. They say it works. If you have to take 4 or 5 different antihypertensives, that just meant you had a severe blood pressure problem, when in fact, the first 3 or 4 pills you had were the wrong ones for you. The 5th works. Nobody removes the first 3 or 4 pills, leaving you on the one that works. And it's the same with the antidepressants and all of the drugs we've got these days.
So you're saying that this partly explains, the phenomenon of polypharmacy and why it's so common now that people will be on a wide variety of psychiatric drugs for a long period of time too.
Yeah.
Mm. What a what a mess. What a grim situation. I keep coming back to that thought. Um, and the rot seems to run quite deep. You've talked a lot about the just what I think you've described as an ethical free fall. And it's hard to look back on the history of psychiatry and find a time when it ever was ethically like accountable or sound. Um, but from wherever its highest point was, it seems to have been on a complete free fall where there's just no integrity in the process that it's kind of seems to be corrupt or misguided like at every level. And I know you've talked a lot about the phenomenon of ghostwriting, when these reports are published in these academic journals that report on the findings of these clinical trials, that even that process, which we all perceive to be, the gold standard of integrity and academic discipline, even that, has not been a process that reflects any level of integrity. That there's all kinds of ghostwriting, that there's all kinds of concealed conflicts of interest. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to this, the ethical freefall or the lack of integrity in the field of psychiatry, both in practice and in the academic side of it, the development and presentation of evidence. Can you speak to this?
Yeah. First of all, I wouldn't like to hold myself up as a person who has more integrity than anyone else or is more ethical than anyone else. We can focus on psychiatrists too much. Psychologists and psychotherapists and counselors are seeing people go through their hands who are having problems on these pills and they do nothing about it. They don't stand up with the person, get in touch with the other doctor and say, look, I think these pills aren't suiting. And part of the situation we've got is whether you're a doctor or a therapist or whatever, we're increasingly working in organizations or companies and things like that. And this isn't just doctors, it's lawyers as well, who work for companies who find it more legally defensible that you keep to the guidelines, the standards of care. So this means you don't recognize the problem that the patient is having. That's going to be the better for us if you don't mention it.
Mm,
It's a bit like the financial crisis. We've got a situation where mortgage lenders, bankers, and things like that were giving us all sorts of things that they wouldn't take themselves. They knew there was a risk that these things were actually going to go wrong. Were they being unethical and things like that? Uh, I don't know that they were any worse than the rest of us. I don't think doctors are any worse than the rest of us. They were caught in a trap. Doctors, in the same way, have no incentives to get it right. It's the difference is with a pilot. If a pilot's flying you from the UK to the United States, she has an incentive to make sure you get there, because if you don't get there, she won't either.
Mm.
So the system knows that if she notices things going wrong or a near miss of things like that and says, look, I'm not going to fly again till this is put right, that she and her colleagues won't fly, so they put it right. Doctors don't have that kind of
Mm.
incentive, although the fact that drugs are available on prescription only means that they've got unique power. They could say to companies, look, we aren't going to use your pill unless you come clean on these problems that we're pretty sure we're seeing, but you're denying that they're actually happening. Okay? The companies have been awfully good at telling the politicians and the public that, well, it's the regulators, the NHRA, it's the FDA, who are responsible for all these things. We're just the company that makes the pills. They kind of tell us what things we need to know. They don't. The regulator looks over the paperwork. The company writes the paperwork. So, the regulator is just a bureaucrat. We've got a system at the moment where nobody's taking responsibility. Now, it's not that they've been unethical, as I say. One of the things we talk about a lot about ethics is conflicts of interest. The free lunches, the trips here and there. Well, I think what we need is more conflict of interest, not less. Doctors need to realize if the drugs work as well as they're being told, as we're being told, and are as safe as we're being told, they're going out of business. Because the companies who run healthcare these days are going to employ nursing staff to prescribe the drugs. They're going to employ maybe pharmacists who are all cheaper prescribers. So rather than encouraging doctors to be purer than pure, and thinking maybe the answer is to say, you guys need to be selfish. If you want to hang on to a job, you need to realize that actually you're going out of business if the pills are the answer rather than you.
Mm.
Back before the antidepressant, one of the things, and it's to do with therapy also, it's the magic used to lie in the general practitioner, the old style general practitioner you went to, who'd been around and seen things and was wise and knew when not to interfere, to say, look, this will clear up. Let's just live with it for a period of time. Then it became a case of, with drugs like the SSRIs, the magic lay in the pill, not the doctor. We need to get back to something much more like, the magic lies in the therapist, the doctor, or whoever, rather than the technique.
Mm. Yes, that makes sense. And I love the analogy of the way that the pilot has an incentive to get you to where you need to go, because if you don't make
Well,
it, they don't make it either. That's great.
let me add one more little bit into that, which is, in medicine, we've got to the point where we're on a plane, we have a pilot, et cetera, who figures that if we die on the plane, she's going to be fine. In medical care, we've reached the point where when you go out to a doctor and get given a pill, you need a parachute.
Mm.
And you need to be willing to open the door and jump out. And that's what a lot of people do, I think. They take these pills and find they don't work and don't go back to the doctor. And they're the ones that get by. They're the ones that get saved. The ones who go back and keep doing as they're told are the ones who are at most risk, which is a crazy situation to be in.
Mm. And the point you were making about the conflicts of interest, am I understanding you right, that what you were saying was that if this trajectory continues and the rate of people taking these drugs increases even more, and it sort of takes over as the only mental health care, that all of the mental health care professionals would then be out of a job? Is that what you were saying?
Yes. And I think if you go to a range of different places in the UK and more so over in the States, you find you won't meet a doctor. You'll meet a nurse who is giving you all your pills and things like that. So, this is creeping up on us pretty quickly.
That's interesting. And so that's how a mental health care professional could see themselves as the pilot in the same plane, where again, like there's an incentive for all of us to not become over reliant on drug treatment. Am I understanding you correctly?
There's an incentive to really get things right.
Yeah.
So, and to be able to say to the management, look, it requires expertise to use these pills because they're not all that safe. They're like nicotine and alcohol. I'm taking risks when we use any of these pills. And that's why you need to listen to what I say, as opposed to just tell me that I have to keep to the guidelines. And you need to pay me a little bit more than the nurse that you've got there.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
Yes. When I think about everything we're talking about, and I think about it all the time, it's the main theme of this whole podcast. It's been, my main area of interest. And when I think about it all, where the strongest indignance arises is when I observe the way that children are being prescribed these drugs just as recklessly as adults are being prescribed these drugs. And to me, I can't handle it. I can't accept it. I feel the need to stand on a mountaintop with a megaphone and shout to the world that this is not okay, that this is reaching levels that we might describe as a crime against humanity. And I understand that there are children who are like, whose behaviors are extremely problematic, whose parents are just completely desperate for anything that will help their child act a little bit more normal and stable. I understand how difficult the problem is. And just because the problem is that difficult, I do not see the solution as being prescribing them poison, even if those poisons appear to have temporary side benefits. And so I would love to know, like, your thoughts on this, what guidance you have. Do you also see this as a serious problem that so many children are being prescribed a variety of drugs? Adderall obviously is very popular. The rates of ADHD diagnoses in the United States in children is just skyrocketing and has been for a long time. And then it's just hand in hand that the prescription of Adderall or other stimulants is going with that. And so I would just love to hear, your thoughts on this, any kind of proposed solutions that you have to this problem.
Yeah, and I think we're backing ourselves into a corner. Um, and it's rather like, you know, um, during the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of people my age, well, maybe 1960s, 1970s, my age, took up smoking. And we took up smoking because we had a parent who smoked. Uh, that's the problem we've got now, which is we're getting a lot of kids put on these pills who have a parent who's on them. And
Mm,
it becomes hard. I mean, if you just got a teenager who figures that, yeah, maybe these pills would help me, and you explain to them, well, you may end up never being able to make love again in your life, they're going to be cautious and say, well, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe you're right. And particularly if I add in, look, you know, I think you're doing fine. I'm happy to keep on seeing you regularly. And if things change, maybe we can use some pills. But if that teenager has a mother or a father or both parents on an SSRI or ADHD drug or whatever, they're going to go home and say, this is what the doctor told me, and be told, oh, don't pay any heed to that. It's a bit like a parent saying, I've been smoking for 20, 30 years and it hasn't caused me any problems. That's a little bit the problem we have. It's the problem has got so big
yeah.
that it's going to take something like the restaurant business, which said you can't smoke in this restaurant. We're going to have something else. I mean, even the Surgeon General coming out and saying you shouldn't be smoking because it causes lung cancer and heart attacks, that didn't do it. It needed a commercial situation where restaurants began saying, well, you can't smoke while you're in this restaurant. So it needs a consumer movement. We need a lot of people like you, like me, saying kids shouldn't really be on these drugs, whatever about people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And one of the big issues is among the target markets is well, not target markets, but among the people most likely to begin these drugs, the ADHD drugs and the SSRIs these days, is teenage girls. And, you know, between them and females um, in their 20s and 30s, you're talking about situations which are terribly toxic in terms of getting pregnant and generally forming kind of stable relationships and things like that. It's a real nightmare that we've got.
That I honestly hadn't ever really thought about that, specifically the point about how many children's parents are also taking some
Mm,
type of psychoactive substance. And I think you're right. I think there's a general, because there's probably an element of the kids' peers also taking it,
yes. Oh
especially if we're
yeah.
talking about high
Sure.
schoolers and things like that. And so it's kind of normalized on every level.
Yeah.
But I think it's especially influential if it's the parents taking it. That's an interesting point. So there's a cultural level at which we have to address this, like a consumer movement, like you said. Um, well, I'm well aware that we've been talking for well over an hour here, and I appreciate that you've got the stamina. But I also want to respect your time, so I won't ask you too many more questions. But I do just want to ask you about what I understand you founded, and I just want to learn a little bit more about it and let listeners learn about it, and the data-based medicine organization. And to be honest with you, I haven't had a chance to explore this much yet, but I believe the website is rxisk.org, and it's meant to help patients report adverse drug effects directly. And the fact that this needed to be founded independently reflects the problem. But can you speak to this? What is this website? And, is it still active? Why did you feel the need to start it?
Yeah. And it was maybe a little bit naive when it began. It was the idea was these pills, generally not just the psychotropic pills, but all pills, antihypertensives and things like that, were having a vast array of effects other than the ones you're being told about, other than the ones your doctor was being told about. You know, blood pressure pills might lower your blood pressure, but they're doing a lot of other things as well. Um, and, they can cause, I mean, all these pills can cause things from uh, um, making your hair change. If it happens straight, it can become curly, and that sounds fine. It can get split ends. You can put color in your hair, and if you're on any of these pills, the color doesn't take. So, the effect is fairly profound. And one of the oddities about that, in the case of the antidepressants and a lot of pills, they began life as dyes. So the fact that, when you add dye into your hair, it doesn't take, or your hair turns green, isn't actually a huge surprise. But what is happening is we don't hear about all this. You're not being told about it. And what we thought was, it'd be interesting to create a forum where people could talk about things like this. The beauty aspects of all these things as much as the health aspects. Um, and that's how it began, but it became off. And one of the other hopes was that if we give you a report, take you through a bunch of questions which let you work out, is your drug likely to be causing the thing you think it's causing you? This will give you a report which you can print off and take back to your doctor to make it easier to have a conversation with them about the problem you think the pill has caused you. Both because there's a score which points to the fact that there is a link probably, but also the fact that he'll know that this has been recorded somewhere. So if you do drop dead, he's at risk of being kind of chase for the fact that he had been told about the problem and didn't do anything about it. We thought this was going to be a great move, but we found that people who are too nervous to go and talk to their doctor, even armed with our report, are too nervous to go and talk to the doctor. So, we have a toxic situation. It's not totally the doctor's fault. It's one of these things where when you go to the doctor, and this was most clear with the vaccines, I think, when you go to the doctor, you will often feel there's a bunch of other people in the room as well. There's the ethicists, there's the lawyers, there's the managers, there's the politicians, etc., etc. You're rarely just seeing the one person. And that's, so as I say, it's not completely the doctor's problem, but there is an issue about how do we put it right? And it's awfully hard to know exactly how to put it right. We've got what one of my colleagues has called an unsafe safety system. We've got a safety system in place which is particularly unsafe because you think we've got a safety system in place. It's actually doing more harm than good. We've got regulators who are supposed to be there to keep an eye on us, to make sure things are safe, who are actually making things less safe. And they're making things less safe, being very ethical. They're being bureaucratic, which means they keep to their job description. The best example I have of this is Study 329 was a study GlaxoSmithKline did of paroxetine in teenagers who are depressed. And they published an article saying this drug works wonderfully well in this clinical trial. It's highly effective and completely safe. Now, this was not a trial done in obscure places or published in an obscure journal. It was published in one of the best journals in the field. It was run by some prestigious university centers. But in actual fact, the article ghostwritten. There were 22 authors on the authorship line. None of them was the person who wrote the article. Okay? So she wrote the article very creatively. I mean, they don't lie. They're just awfully creative the way they do things. And the article helped paroxetine sales. And GSK just got a bit greedy, I guess, and thought, we'll apply to FDA to get this drug approved so we can openly claim that our drug is an antidepressant for teenagers. And they wrote to FDA and said, look, here's 3 trials we've done. They're all negative. And FDA approved paroxetine for teenagers, at least wrote what's called an approvable letter, okay, and said, we agree with you, all 3 trials are negative. We're still going to approve the drug, and we agree with you, we're not going to mention the fact that they were negative in the label of the drug, okay? Even though there was a published article out there, which FDA at this stage then must have known was essentially fraudulent. So you ask yourself, why would FDA do this? Why would MHRA do this? And the answer is, well, it's not part of their job description to police the medical literature. So, it's the job description for doctors and journal editors. And journal editors are too frightened to take any adverse event reports on drugs at all. The BBC and just as much as the BMJ have what's called a false balance policy, which is, you'll have heard, I'm sure most listeners will have heard about the famous doubt is our product kind of strategy.
Say it again. Heard of what?
The doubt is our product.
Doubt is our product.
A approach to handling the risks of lung cancer when you actually smoke. Okay, so industry were able to sort of produce lots of research papers and make the general point, look, life expectancy has been going up since people began to smoke. You know, our products couldn't be causing lung cancer or causing people to die early if life expectancy is growing up. Okay? So what we've got now is the mirror image of that, which is companies argue randomized controlled trials. The science has shown our pill works. It will be a bit like, you know, you'd be engaged in a war on science if you don't just put that view forward on the BBC or whatever. If you start talking about the adverse effects of drugs, you're essentially giving legitimacy to things like people who think the earth is flat or astrologers or whatever. It's a false balance. The science has shown whatever, and you, the BBC, and you, the BMJ, need to keep to the science and not deter people from taking the pills, because if you do deter people from taking the pills, you'll have blood on your hands. It's as upfront as that. Okay? So that's again part of the unholy mess we've got. And how to put it right is ain't easy.
Yes, I think you just really, put your finger on something important about the culture, and it's ironic because it's quite unscientific to acknowledge the data. And it's quite unscientific to be
Well,
beholden to someone's,
well, just on that score, you open all this up by asking what's database medicine. Database medicine was coined as a contrast to evidence-based medicine. The data is not a set of figures. The data in a clinical trial is you and me. Austin Bradford Hill, who ran the first randomized controlled trial, said it's more important to talk to the person and work out what you and the person think has happened to them on this drug than to pay heed to the clinical trial result. It's, so the data are the people. When FDA and MHRA scrutinize what companies send them, they don't have people's names. Let me give you one quick story about PSSD,
please.
which brings the point home, I think. The first lady who convinced me PSSD was real. I mean, as it turns out, we've known about PSSD. That's post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. We've known about this since the 1980s. I got exposed to it in person for the first time 25 years ago. When this lady comes in, she's on an SSRI, she's genitally numb and is lost libido. And well, when I said she's on an SSRI, she has been on an SSRI because she says to me, look, she's actually having a problem making love. And I say, well, yes, these drugs can cause that. But, once you come off them, things will be fine. And she looks at me and says, well, I've been off this for 3 months. And I can take a hard bristled brush and rub it up and down my genitals and feel nothing. So that put me in my place. When you hear something like this, you realize there's nothing else other than the drug can have caused this. This is just what the drugs cause when you go on them. The issue here in this lady's case was it was still going on 3 months later, and there's people for whom it's been going on 20 or 30 years later. But here's the point. After we opened up risk.org, database medicine, the single commonest thing people began to report to us was PSSD, this enduring sexual problem after they halted the pills. And nobody at the time, it's a bit like AIDS, nobody wanted to let anyone know they had PSSD. They've more recently begun to come out and say, look, I'm John Smith and I've got PSSD, etc., etc. which took a lot of nerve and courage. But we had at the time hundreds of reports of people, and we got this idea about let's get in touch with FDA and the European Medicines Agency and persuade a bunch of people to leave their name on the report and to get a letter from their doctor saying that he or she isn't clear that the drug has caused the problem, but they cannot see any other way that this problem has turned up. The fact that people can be as genitally numb as this, they can rub chili paste into their genitals and feel nothing. So we got 80 people to leave their names on the reports, and half of them got their doctor to write a letter also. We sent a petition into FDA and a petition into EMA, and FDA, well, yes, and we said we could also send these 80 reports. FDA didn't want to hear about it. EMA, I happened to know the man who was in charge of it. So he said, yes, we'll take your reports. Okay. And so I bundled them all up, 80 reports plus 40 letters, sent them to EMA, and got in touch with the guy I knew a few weeks later just to make sure he got all the material. And he said, yes, we have. And I'm sure you'll be pleased to know, he said, that following procedures, we've removed all names. They were told, the covering letter was, we think you cannot decide this drug is causing the problem without being able to contact the people. The idea being that if you contact a person who says, I can rub a hard bristle brush up and down my genitals and feel nothing, there's no condition in medicine that can cause this. There's no option but to say the drug has caused the problem. And that's where it comes back to. The data is a person. If you don't have the person's name, you can't know what's going on. If you get to interview them, you may not be absolutely sure, but certainly without being able to talk to people, you can't know. And to an extent, while my job and your job is to not always believe the things we're told by people, at the same time, when they bring a problem to you, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be trying to be as honest as they can, because medicine doesn't work if they're not being as honest as they can.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I love that framing, that data, people.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we've got a bunch of figures we can abstract from the person, but at the end of the day, the datum is the person. To work out, my blood cholesterol might be awfully high, but lots of people's blood cholesterol, my blood cholesterol is awfully high, but the human body manages these. You might have this bit a bit higher, but other things will be low. There's a balance that it keeps if you don't interfere with it too much.
Right.
Interfering can be a problem.
Right. And it's, I guess my last comment on this is that, I think one of the challenges is that our healthcare systems in general don't leave a lot of time for the practitioner to get to know the person. And so we have to take these like broad strokes, and ultimately it's very reductive in nature. We no longer see the person in the data. We just see the figures and the numbers and the broad strokes and the abstractions. But it's, I guess I would just say I really commend people like you or any practitioner out there who makes the effort and spends the time necessary to get to know the individual, to listen to them. I really hear that a lot in what you are saying, that it's part of your practice. It's part of the right way to practice, to really take the person seriously and to really listen to them and to attempt to get to know them well and to understand the variety of factors that are shaping their experience. So I commend you. I really respect that. I commend anyone else who practices in that way, who sees the person.
Let me just add quickly to that. You
Please.
said people don't have the time. Well, part of the reason people don't have the time is it used to be the case of you took a problem to me Now the system calls you in for screening and gives you problems that you're not experiencing, that you don't think you have. And it's only, I mean, it's not a real problem. It's just a potential, a notional risk,
Mm.
you know? So we're spending a huge amount of time. 90% of the time is on giving people problems rather than handling the ones they bring to us.
That's interesting
Mm.
and true. Yeah. Wow. Well, this is what an honor just to talk to you for an hour and a half here. What an absolute honor, Dr. Healy. Thank you for joining me. And yeah, and thank you for all the work that you've done. It's just incredible to like look over your whole body of work. It's amazing.
Nick, thanks very much for asking me. It's been a good chat, and hopefully the sound quality is not going to be too bad.
I hope so too. Yeah, and
Mm.
I think we'll be able to turn the volume up and balance it out. And I always want to give a big shout out to listeners who listened to the whole conversation. I'm so glad that it kept your attention and that you found it to be compelling enough to listen to. And so, Dr. Healy, I'm so glad we are connected, and I hope to stay in touch. And again, thank you so much for all the work you're doing to kind of steer us toward a more really truly scientific, human based, way of practicing. So, thank you. Thank you to the Psychology as audience. Until next time.